I'm not sure I'm going to use the podium this morning because my blood alcohol is such that I might fall off it. And from that point of view, I'm afraid I'm going to also have to rely on you quite considerably to stimulate me and challenge me to get my head awake this morning and to respond in some kind of meaningful way to your questions. Thank you for your introduction. Yes, I have been around for quite a long time in the homeopathic field. I have struggled with this discipline for longer than I care to think. And that in some ways brings me along to my very first point, which is the question of how we know what we know in homeopathy. What do we know? And that might seem like a glib question, but you know, as I stand here before you, you know, I can recount instances from my homeopathic past and possibly reference points in the things that I've seen and heard through these many patients. But I'm not sure that I can tell you what I know from that. For example, can anybody tell me whether symphytum works at all for, you know, accelerating bone healing? Can anybody tell me?
Well, if you treat people, they seem to actually heal quicker.
They seem to heal quicker.
My son had a broken arm and it was x-rayed periodically, and the physician, the hospital physician was very surprised at how fast it was healing. That's only one anecdote.
No, mine is
but the x-ray showed it.
Okay, well it's very interesting to hear those anecdotes and to hear your personal experience. I mean, I have prescribed symphytum many times, you know, over 30 years. Inevitably, people turn up at your NHS practice or your clinic and they say, well, we've had a fracture, we've had a fall, we've had this and that. But I can't tell you whether symphytum works. And yes, of course, you know, if I dredge the literature, you know, I can find anecdotes and comments and personal testimonies even, but I can't tell you that it works, and I'm certainly nowhere even close to being able to prove that it works. If I actually look at responses to arnica, which is one of our it's a talisman for homeopathy, and many people enter or come into homeopathy because of a direct personal experience with arnica, either with themselves or with their children. But if I trawl through 3,000 cases that I've seen, I find only 2 cases in 30 years which I would put a significant score of 4 on, and I'll talk about those significant scores a little later. 2 cases in 30 years where I can say, not with certainty, but with a certain degree of wonderment, that arnica did something remarkable and wonderful and transformative in the case. That's not to say that I haven't seen so many anecdotes and people coming in and say, well, you know, I was the only person in the ward not to have periorbital bruising after, you know, a submucous resection. Yeah. And I was the one who had the arnica. And my orthopedic surgeon was so impressed with the lack of bruising after my total hip replacement. Yes, there are lots and lots of those comments. I have them on video and I have them written in my case files. But those are what they are. They're anecdotes and they are not proof. And it is impossible in homeopathy to prove anything, quite frankly. And proof actually shouldn't be our goal as far as I'm concerned. And as I go on and as I struggle and succeed and fail through clinic after clinic, I start to understand more that it is not a case of looking for the holy grail of cures, particularly in an extremely chronic caseload that I'm currently working with. It's also a case of not being sucked into a form of a what's the word I'm looking for? A confirmation bias around what we're doing. And it's not also a case of believing in your own constructs for the action of remedies. And of course, those of you who have, I've been teaching in London over many years will understand where I'm coming from, because very often when we're dealing with a long case, we're looking in considerable detail at the modelling and how we model the case. And it's that modelling, that alternative paradigm in the understanding of illness that we're using to attempt to find a mirror for complexity. But if the remedy works and we have a fabulous remedy response, that does not prove that our construct was correct. It does not prove that the thinking behind the remedy was in fact the right, the right choice. Because particularly as time goes on and you see many thousands of cases, if you think about the spread of the materia medica, every so often, by chance, you will encounter a remedy response that you hit it almost by some freak of accident. You achieve a marvelous remedy response. That is what I'm not trying to do here is overcomplicate the issue or prevent modelling, because it's vital that in homeopathy we have permission to model our thinking and our approach to a case in ways that is not institutionalized. And we have to preserve that right very strongly. We as a community have to argue the right to be able to prescribe on models that are not set along lines of evidence or along lines that are necessarily even structured around deterministic ideas of sickness and health. Because if we are entrapped by that and by evidence-constrained medicine, then we also constrain our patients as well. We constrain the potential for change in often extremely stuck and very intransigent clinical problems. So we as a community must preserve the right to think out of the box, to think laterally, to construct something anew and fresh and individualized for the patient. Yet, we mustn't be sucked into the belief system that our constructions are the realities. They are modeling. They are not the realities. And we use models all the time. Even going back to Hahnemann, the idea of the original miasmatic labels are labels for illness categories. They are not in themselves complete, watertight scientific paradigms. So it brings me back again to what is it we know, what is it we understand? And for a whole variety of personal reasons that I've been through some kind of churning in my recent past. I've relocated a practice which was in relative disarray. My own personal chaos meant that there were 30 years of case files stacked haphazardly in boxes. In fact, there were roughly 30 banana boxes that had to be put into storage of clinical cases. And the question is, well, what do you do with all that? Do I burn it? Do I shred it? Do I send it to an industrial shredder and pay money to get them to destroy all these cases that that I've collected? And those of you who know me a bit better will probably say, well, a good dose of sulfur or some sulfur salt might sort you out. And I have to ask myself, well, why hang on to thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of written narrative and patient outcomes in this disturbingly disorganized way? Partly because there is something in me that respects empiricism. And it's something that I've respected for a long time. I respect it in some of my forebears and in the antecedents in our country who collected data, whose relevance they didn't actually really understand fully in their own time. The country parsons and the local country doctors who collected data around the prevalence of butterflies and the prevalence of moths and the ambient temperatures and the ground temperatures and the air temperatures and the cloud shapes at different times of the year and all the other things that in the 19th century the amateur scientist was collating across the United Kingdom. Nowadays, these parish records can be churned up and looked at by people who are trying to track the effects of climate change, trying to look at patterns of migration, trying to understand bird populations, trying to understand the incidence within our biological world. And we exist within a shifting and multifaceted and complex biological world in which empirical observation is frankly vital to access a level of understanding of it. We can only grasp some aspects of complexity. We can only touch a few aspects of the complexity in biological systems. And we can, by describing it and collating it, start to get a little closer to that knowledge. Now, we talked a moment ago about the power of the anecdote. And the power of the anecdote is incredible. It's what inspires us when we hear our colleagues bringing a case to us that has been transformed by the input of homeopathy. The transformative power of homeopathy in those of us who are using it is beyond doubt. And when we listen to our colleagues talking about their journey with a case and the keys that they have found that helped them create the insights and the mirroring in the case for transformation, that is inspiring to us. But we also have to understand that though the miracle cases that we see are often the exception. In a chronic caseload, we're seeing a lot of patients with very difficult, multifaceted, multimorbid cases. We're seeing a huge, and certainly in general homeopathy, we're seeing a huge spectrum of cases. Children 1 minute, aged people the next minute with multimorbid conditions or neurodegenerative conditions or so on. People who come to us because they've run against the buffers and they're running out of therapeutic options. And our transformative power in those cases a lot of the time doesn't match what we see from our great teachers in terms of the fabulous responses. And many of the most fabulous responses are so idiomatic that we cannot reproduce them, even when we model cases in parallel with those same indications. We don't get the same responses, we don't see the same responses. And often the remedies that are presented to us by our friends and colleagues are materials that we might find it takes 10 years to meet that material, meet the indications for it. We may or not then be able to apply it. That's not to say that the process, the thinking process behind that remedy selection is not something we should learn from, because the individual pathway to finding the simillimum is something that we all need to follow. And the more often we follow the pathways of senior colleagues and their thinking and understand how they're constructing the indications, the more enabled we are. Yet, we may not be applying a potency of some rare beetle or some bird talon or some strange Antipodean plant even within our own lifetime. And I'm very conscious of the fact that within my own teaching, I'm sometimes presenting cases which it is not fair in some ways to present because they represent a synthesis that I know that my students are not going to encounter. So where are we? I've talked about this idea that we need to collate information. We need to be empiricists. We need to be free to gather information over time. We need to be free to exchange it, and we need to be able to collate it in some ways to try and find meaning and try and ground what we know over time. Until even to this moment, Students who ask me, well, what is the difference between high potency reaction patterns and low potency reaction patterns? Well, I might construct something that I think is right. You know, how often do you see a remedy aggravation? And is your remedy aggravation of single locals or of multiple locals, or is it a remedy aggravation that involves mind symptoms or systemic symptoms? What do I know about that? And, you know, a patient who, or a student who's asking me, well, how many times have you treated this kind of case? Or how many times, what's your success rate for alopecia or whatever else? Yeah, okay, well, I can grab something out of the air and come up with conjure up some thing in the heat of the moment in front of my students. But that is not the same as being informed. And it's not the same as actually being truly authentic with them either. Until I have collated and managed to tap into my knowledge base, which at the moment, or until, well, even, yes, at the moment, I'm still only partially able to do. So in trying to find our way through this and trying to find out even what I know, which I don't know, believe it or not, I encountered a tool. And it is just a tool, and like all tools, it has its strengths and weaknesses and flaws and idiosyncrasies. I'll show you this tool, and it is nothing more than a document management system. Document management system, oh, yawn. Sunday morning, let's go back to bed. This man is going to give us audit and document management systems. I mean, really. But, you know, if I'm faced with thousands of case files, I mean thousands of them, and pages of written out responses and things that patients have said, and I've scratched these down with all the intensity and verve of a 19th century empiricist, and they're all lying there in dust, you know, no, I'm not going to go and shred them all. And of course it's very mixed. It's non-responders and frustrating responses and people who've had aggravations and then haven't got better, or people who say, oh, well, I was better for 3 days, you know, but look, it's not changed, you know. Yeah, right, okay. Amongst all that, though, I have to know to some extent, well, what am I doing? You know, am I being effective over time? So what I did was I take these 36 banana boxes of case files and I put them through a high-speed scanner for my sins, and I tab them with a label, a patient identifier, and then I scour the internet saying, well, you know, I've got 3,000, 4,000 patient files there. How on earth am I going to access them? And document management systems have been around for a long time, but I'm a fairly antiquated person. It takes me 10 years to catch up with technologies, as my technical colleagues have already observed. So I scour the internet and I find something which is actually, to some extent, customizable. In other words, it's not completely off the shelf and, well, you patch it in here and patch it in there and you do what it says. It gives you some customizable fields. So if I look here, I can say, well, I'm going to categorize in this box my patients, and I'm going to categorize in this box my private patients. Then I'm going to categorize in these the known responders. And you'll see here that what started off as 1,000 files has now dropped to 403 files. Because at the moment, I've only managed to put 1,000 files into the system. I've only managed to, over a year, put in 1,000 files, and so it's going to take me at least 3 years to put in all the case files that I apparently have, and then it's going to take me another couple of years to put in all the data from my old databases and collate that with dispensary slips and look at all the thousands and thousands of old appointment sheets and see that I've got everything in. And you may say, well, why on earth do that? Why on earth put in everything? One of the reasons is that it is going to be an imperfect data set, but it will be so huge that, you know, if I do choose to do a search on, you know, +3 responses to antimonium crudum, and I want to see all the case files listed over 30 years for antimonium crudum that I've had what I would call a +3 response, then I want to be able to see it. And if I have missing cases or bits that are only got partial information or a limited information, then I may still want to use areas of limited information if there's something in that that I can derive, that I can use to create insight. So all right, so I've got amongst my private practice patients 403 patients of known responders. Of minor responses, I've got 139. In my NHS patients, there are 322 documents at the moment, of which there are known responders are 282. If I click on the thing here, I can see the case, I can see the documents, and I can see all the case files are all in there, you know, everything is there that I can see at a button. So I can find everything by those parameters pretty quickly, NHS patients and private patients and so on. But that's not where the thing ends. Oops, it's just about where things ends if I don't press the right button. I can then say, well, it's not just enough to be able to find your files. You know, I would like to know, I'd like to be able to raise, if in the future, I'd like to be able to raise a case series. I'd like to find all my aurum mur natrinatum cases, see if there's anything comparable about them, see whether or not there's a case series there, and see whether or not there's actually some kind of even a research question to ask. You know, I don't know the answers, and I can't say with any surety, and I'm not going to seek proof, nor am I going to use this to say, well, you know, I've got a better response rate than you, hey, you know. What I need to know is whether or not I'm even remotely getting it right around certain areas or certain regions of knowledge. You know, I want to be able to take 10 or 15 dysentery co-cases, you know, and say, well, amongst these 10 dysentery co-cases, the literature says that, you know, they're aggravated after Shigella, they tend to be thermostatically unstable, and, you know, they tend to be people who are pressurizing themselves into bowel dysbiosis and giving themselves a real block to cure at a biological level. That's what the literature says. But what do I say? Are they thermostatically unstable? Let's draw out 10, 15 cases over 30 years and actually see what I actually wrote in 1990 and 1993 and 1995 and 2006, and, you know, what did I actually write down about them? Can I confirm it? If I can confirm it, will I be able eventually to create some kind of weighted rubric around it and help other people find the indications for that remedy? Because if I just stand in front of a class and they ask me off the top of my head what the indications are, yeah, I will fumble away just like everybody else is fumbling, and I might be able to invoke enough memory of enough cases to give them some kind of reasoned answer. But it's not the same. It's not the same as actually being able, in a moment's notice, to pull up a case or two, actually have a look inside and say whether or not that was correct. So I've tried to organize this, and all this is customizable. You create all these fields and these things yourself. If you chose to use this kind of program, you'd fill in, you'd ask yourself, well, what research questions would I like to ask of my caseload? I've tended to ask certain things, you know, so among my known responders, how many of them can I say have a dominant single remedy tag, where one remedy is so strongly transformative in the case that, you know, this remedy represents something or summation of the case? Well, there are 188 documents in there so far where there's a single remedy tag. I might also want to say, well, look, I have 188 remedies where one remedy has been so, it's 188 cases where one remedy has been so dominant and transformative for the case, how on earth did I get to that remedy? So while the other research questions, I've said, well, what is the methodology? And here we've got unknown methodology, Materia Medica Kent, of 16 cases at the moment, a Materia Medica symptom cluster, 28, a Materia Medica group, constitutional, 31, a hand repertorization, of which there are still a few around in here, Kent-style repertorizations, computer repertorizations, bowel nodode analysis, a flat Bönninghausen analysis, or a Bönninghausen analysis with polarities, triangulation on a Scholten model, or a triangulation using sensations methods, remedy relationships, etiological prescribing, where I've come up with, well, this is what happened, this is what you give, and or synthetic analysis of various kinds, where, quite frankly, I'm shifting between so many different models that I don't even really know what I'm doing myself, yet the remedy works, you know. Pathological affinities, 12 cases in there, miasmatic, acute picture cases, mind essences, symbolic remedy expressions, particularly with animal remedies where they come in wearing their snake skins and their hair is all Medusa-like and they're telling you they've got dreams of being chased by worms, and you think, I wonder what remedies group that might be, you know, and various, I don't know, other things. So among the single remedy tags, already I'm saying, well, what kind of research questions might I want to raise in 10 years from these single remedies? Taking 3,000 cases and managing to find, let's say, 12 cases of natrum mur or something, or whatever it happens to be, and actually then scanning these cases for areas of consistency and patterns. Of course, like anything else, we mustn't be involved in forms of confirmation bias. And the real problem with homeopathy is that we're confirming our biases continuously and confirming our prejudices continuously, and we have got to break out of that. Because if we don't do that continuously and break down our own prejudices, we end up in a form of routine prescribing, which is actually as reductionist and as codified as anything orthodox medicine is doing, and that we've got to avoid. We've got to keep ourselves fresh, and in order to keep ourselves and our ideas fresh, we've got to challenge ourselves and be critical of everything that we see and not swallow everything that gets told to us, including the things that are told to us in good faith by patients and by colleagues. So it's this, the questioning and the continual questioning in a homeopath is one of the things that will drive them methodologically forward and help them in self-development. But still, nevertheless, identifying patterns, being able to collate empiricism into forms of meaningful collations is part of the job. Now, it may well be that these patterns are things that I never in my own lifetime ever get around to looking at, and it may be the whole thing just burns and fizzles out and it's got absolutely no meaning, or it may be that a colleague, a well-meaning and rather patient individual, trawls through it, does the data search for something that they have an interest in, raises a research question, and actually goes on to find some form of collated information that I never ever in my own lifetime managed to get around to doing, which is also fine. Because the field itself is so enormous that we cannot understand or grasp all the elements even within a small area of this knowledge base. So, I mean, I have several areas of interest. So, for example, sequencing, remedy sequencing in chronic cases, you know, where you're using a primary remedy to try and unblock the case, where there's a biological or acquired block to cure, the bowel is completely dysbiotic, they're sick, they're toxic, they're bloated, they're headachy, and you can see a constitutional remedy and you can see a nice narrative time frame and you can see lots of etiologies in the case, but unless you actually unblock the case first with a bowel nosode, then you're whistling, quite frankly. And it's the sequencing or the strategic sequencing of remedies, often which have empirical relationships derived from our predecessors, the things that our predecessors have identified as clinical relationships across time, that I think also require us to reconfirm and to re-engage with. There are entire books about remedy relationships and clinical relationships. Of course, over time, we're starting to get a feel for natural relationships, which are actually embedded with thousands of different delusions, because when we look at a lot of natural relationships, they are in morphological terms or in terms of doctrines of signatures or source materials, they have all sorts of patterns that are consistent. Yet when we look at the materia medica pictures or their indications of the way they behave biologically, they're often so diverse that the grouping idea breaks down in practice. So finding out how many of those groups or have enough consistency to be really reliable is another challenge, and it takes a long time to achieve that. It takes a long time to be able to get a sense of whether or not remedy sequencing, relationships of remedies, natural relationships, clinical relationships, or temporal relationships are actually real, or whether they're based on small clusters or little fragments of individual experience. It takes several lifetimes probably to be able to get a grasp on that kind of confirmation. But you see here, for example, I'm starting to look at strategic sequencing. So cases where bowel nosodes have strategically been followed by classical remedies, isopathic in classical remedies, tautopathic in classical remedies, acute similars in classical remedies, etiological nosodes moving towards constitutions, tautopathic to constitution, constitution to bowel nosode, classical to classical, classical to bowel nosodes, starting to collate together clusters across 30 years of sequencings, so that when I want to start to explore remedy relationships, either natural or otherwise, I can actually start to pull out cases, 5 cases, where the original natural relationships between, for example, a nosode and a classical remedy apparently have worked out or have delivered a transformative outcome. So these are the kinds of things that I'm looking at, and each little bit, each category of case actually in itself implies different research questions. Even their negative responses, whether or not there were systemic aggravations, local aggravations, aggravations or mind and local aggravations or nocebo responses, I would like to know them over time. So if I'm starting to look a little bit more in depth, just starting to use keyword searches, you know, for example, I might want to say, well, let's look for all natrium mur cases. Let's look for natrium mur and headache cases in my female population, for example. And I'll start by doing a search on all the entire caseload. And so this thing starts to pull out a case here of a female natrium mur, but here's a headache female cases. All the female headache cases are there. Here's another strand here that has all the natrium mur cases that are not headaches or female, and here's another strand here which contains some more headache cases that are in neither of these other camps. And so these different groups, these are all the female patients, and of course there are thousands of them. But just looking at a few simple search parameters allows me to start to look at those cases. If, for example, I want to look at all the female natrium mur cases that have had what I would call a +3 response. Who knows what it'll throw up, but there we are. There's 2 patients there at the moment amongst those thousands that have had a +3 response to natrium mur. It doesn't look actually as if it's There we are. There we are. For other presentations, there are thousands of cases in there of female +3 responses. Now, it brings me down in the last moments to talk about how I'm classifying response patterns, because I'm no longer using the outcome scores that I've been thinking of for many years, or that have been used in so many audit plans, because they don't tell us about significance. So, for example, if I have a patient with warts who comes back 3 weeks later, says, "Doctor, the warts have all gone. Thuya's cured me. Look." And that's lovely, but it doesn't prove anything, because the warts do go. That's not as if you were looking at an outcome score, that score is +4. If you're looking at a significance score, that score is +1. And if you're looking at outcomes in terms of context, we can only really start to search. If we're going to do significance searching, we can only really tab the cases not on outcome, but on the significance for the condition we're looking at. So, I mean, I'm not even remotely going anywhere near the presentation I actually had put together for today, but one of the slides I had showed the incidence of outcomes from the first searches. If I can find it here. Yeah, there's all this stuff that I was going to talk about, but we're not going to get anywhere near there. Let's see. It's not even that presentation, I'll find it. It's not on that one either. Yeah, so the outcome scale, no, it's not on that either. What I wanted to say is that if we're trying to measure outcomes according to significance, you can only have significance in one direction. You can't have negative significance. So a patient response pattern is either significant or it's not. And if we were looking at what I would call a +4 response, or a +4+ response, it has to fulfill quite a lot of criteria. It has to be in a patient in whom the outcome outstrips expectation in many, many ways. They often have to be multimorbid, they have to be chronic, they have to you have to have had failed responses orthodoxly and homeopathically. There has to be a response pattern from the remedy, which includes parts of remedy expressions and visible exteriorization signs, or parts of the remedy expression that are visible and can be seen or touched, or it also needs subjective changes, and it needs to last for a long time. It's not a flash in the pan. Now, if I look at the incidence of what I call +4 or +4+ responses, I only have about 8 cases over 30 years in the database so far. Though those cases are, they are cases with a response pattern which is so marked that you have great difficulty explaining them in anything other than a response to a remedy. It has to be a high potency remedy. If the patient to some extent is blinded as well to the they have to be blinded to the remedy. It's another factor in the equation. And if they are to some extent unconscious even of having the remedy itself, that helps to support these cases. Everything else runs below that. There are many, many other levels of significance down the line. You get short, transient responses in patients with who feel better the day they take the remedy, and then everything dies a death. And then you have patients somewhere in between who have partial responses but with no objective features. And you have other patients who have aggravations and amelioration patterns, and it looks consistently in time frames consistent with the remedies and the potencies chosen, and within the context of the illness pattern as well. So if you're going to put, what I'm trying to say is you're going to put a significant score on a remedy response, that significant score has to be contextualized to the case. You cannot say, if a patient comes back after a month, saying, I'm feeling fabulous and I'm skipping into the clinic and my pains are 70% better. That's great, but it is a spot diagnosis, it's a spot event, it's a moment in time. It is not a significant score for the remedy. It is, and so what I'm trying to do is move away from the outcome scores and the Glasgow Homeopathic scale because it doesn't give me a significance. And when I am going to look for, over the years, a collation or collection of cases, then I want to be able to pull out the significant cases, not the ones where necessarily an outcome score or a spot evaluation pulls them out artificially for me. So that's where I'm at. I'm sorry that my presentation is somewhat garbled and slightly hungover and a bit all over the place. Just to sum up, I believe in empiricism. I believe that homeopathy is the gold standard of empiricism. I believe that we need to give ourselves permission to be empiricists. We need to preserve that right, but we need to also deserve the right to be empiricists. We've got to be critical thinkers, we've got to collate our information, we've got to be very patient, and we've got to evaluate it in ways that will allow us to try and make sense of patterns without extrapolating, and without projection, and without self-deception. We've got to do those things. And if we do it consistently and we manage to share that information over time with one another, then we can build homeopathy. Otherwise, we're in free-floating territory. Our discipline churns. It just churns. It turns itself over in a speculative mass, and it creates internal schisms within the ideologies that can actually separate and cause problems and strife within our field. And we need to be able to get past that. In order to progress our own field, I feel very passionate about the need for guided and structured empiricism.
Thank you, Russell.
Russell gave such an excellent summary. Thank you so much. And I think we're all grateful that we have an empiricist like Russell in our community, and someone who also wasn't encouraged to declutter and throw out that lovely mass of data and all these caseloads. And I think we can all take up the challenge and look to this as a kind of manifesto and a way of cooperating with each other and looking at significance. You know, I'm taking that on board because my caseload is chronic cases like Russell's. Anyway, we're very pleased we have some time for questions. So, Susanna.
What is the name of that specific program? Sorry, what's the name of that program that you use? Can you see it?
It's called MyDoc 3D. It costs about £60 or £70, and it's a bit funny. You'll get occasionally dialogue boxes coming up in French, and the date fields don't seem to be customizable to British format. They're an American format. You may well find something better if you search. But what I like about it is it's extremely powerful, very simple, I mean, I haven't presented the extractions, really, the structured extractions that I've already tried to do. But it actually allows you to set your research questions and your search questions and your search parameters and collate the materials the way you want them to do it. As mine are abstruse, quite frankly, but you know, you can do it your way. And it's very user-friendly. But the power of it and the way that it retrieves files is quite remarkable.
I find it interesting that you have shifted away from an outcomes-based kind, if I've got this correctly, because the NHS is moving towards outcomes-based. That is our whole projection. Well,
the real problem is that when you're dealing with chronic cases, they don't behave in that way. The huge caseload, the big burden on our society comes from chronic cases. Cases that need care over long periods of time and whose care requirements shift and change and whose mood adapts and modulates and whose prescribing goes up and down and who are in a half-treated, half-managed state. And they take up mass areas of NHS resources and they cannot be knocked into an outcome box. They require a care framework. And a care framework which involves an entirely different behaviour from the practitioner. It requires almost a 19th century approach to the value of the practitioner in their being, in their quality of their engagement, in the synthesis of their thought, in the forms of individualization, in the tracking of often small changes across long periods of time, and in the ways that we manage to achieve some prescribing at times. And those are the really valuable things that to track. Trying to track outcomes in a chronic caseload, you tell me how it can be done and you know, I would be delighted to do it. It's impossible. You know.
But I think then there is just the danger of, yes, research and being able to pin down and having the good empirical evidence loses the essence of the quality of it and the experience of the person. Sometimes you can get a wee bit too focused on trying to get specific data that you lose the essence.
I'm not quite sure I understand what the question is.
It's more a comment of, you know, you're trying to quantify and have quantifiable things.
Well, the thing is that when you're trying to create quantifiable stuff, who are you creating it for? I mean, you're creating it for the finance manager, the business manager, the chief executive, the people who look after your job. You know, you're not creating that kind of data for patient benefit. You're creating it for the system. And homeopaths, sure, we have a duty to the systems that we exist in, but our primary duty is to the patient, and we must get out of the way of spending our energies feeding quasi-data into healthcare systems. We must recreate the argument for good care. And that's not something you get out of notional outcome scores in chronic cases. You might, if you're in subacute or acute medicine, be able to find outcome measures for certain conditions that please both you and please your patients. But my caseload is chronic, difficult, multimorbid, full of prescribing. They need to be supported, shifted, cared for over periods of time, and I need to be able to understand a +1 response, which is a completely hopeless outcome in an acute case or in a subacute case for a patient who's got chronic pain, can be life transformative, plus the levels of support, of personal support that goes with the homeopathic engagement. And we as a community need to get away from trying to prove ourselves, using crude data that's meaningless. We have to get away from that.
I've got a couple of very simple questions. How long does it take you to input a case into the system? And secondly, you've decided on certain categories. Should you now have a blinding flash and think, oh, I have to have this category in, can you add that in after you've predefined your subcategories?
Well, all these fields are all shiftable and addable in. You know, so for example, you know, if I get a patient who I'm putting into the case, it's a new patient file. It's a private case. It's a known responder, and let's say it's a single remedy tag where I've had a constitutional response. If it's not in the list there, if it's not in the constitutional list that I've already got here, where all the other patients that have been put in exist, then I can add in the category. And I can add in the category at any level. And I can also tag the case with any keyword I want. Interestingly, the management system allows you to put in fully readable PDFs and document files, but I don't think that's as valuable. If you have a case file which is typed out, and it's got all the buts and ifs and patient words and all the other things, and it's trying to search through an entire file, rather than a few taglines or a few tags, the whole thing becomes much more cumbersome. So I've scanned in the cases directly in the written form, and then I've added keywords to the end of it. So if I look at the keywords for this particular patient here, I'm running this on a very slow machine. It's going to hang on me now, but well, there's a limited list of keywords. No, it's not what I wanted to do. So there they are. The patient identifiers, their age, their main presenting complaints, which are all searchable, a high potency, a +2 response, significance response. It's a chronic multimorbid case. They're on 2 orthodox medicines when they present, because I also want to be able over time to tell my students whether or not the number of orthodox drugs the patients are on at first presentation is any predictor of the level or success rate. And at the moment I can't tell you that. It's a fundamental question. If a patient comes on 8 drugs, are they less liable to respond to a homeopathic remedy than if they come to you on 3? I can't tell you the answer to that. There's many questions at the moment I can't answer that a student may bring up to me in a teaching session. But in the future, I'll be able to say, right, well, let's have a look at the response rates for patients who come to me on 3 drugs and the response rates for people who come on 8 drugs. Let's see whether or not over 30 years I can show a change in outcomes for these different patient groups. So I mean, you can customize it to exactly the way you want to do it. You make your own search parameters, you use your own keywords, you put your own categories in, customize it just the way you want to do it for the research questions you want to ask.
Maybe one more question?
Yeah, Russell, I agree with everything there, that's great. And just a couple of safety issues. I suppose it should be registered at the work or something with the Information Commissioner's Office.
You need to be in data protection, yes. But anybody in practice who's using case files, if you're in the NHS, then the Data Protection Act covers your work within the NHS setting. If you're doing it privately and you're in a private setting, or if you're using data outside of a system like the NHS, then you have to be Data Protection Act registered separately. Yep.
Yeah. Time for last one, yes.
Russell, thank you for
Is there a microphone? Thank you.
Thank you. Russell, thank you for a lovely presentation. It created, I can relate, my case files were packed in deciduous fruit boxes. They were apple boxes at the end of my clinical practice. But I think listening to your presentation makes a profound case for the clinician of today to start early on in the practice with an electronic case registry. You're looking at your cases, it's going to take you 4 years to load them, and you're looking at them through the retrospectoscope, which is a very powerful instrument. But it would be so much better to have your fields built in to a modern case registry, so they've got your wisdom, the newer clinicians going forward, and then they could modulate their practice going forward rather than waiting for 30 years and then looking back.
Yes, I think that the whole question around whether or not you can find an algorithm for certain kinds of cases. I mean, those of you who've been worked with me in bowel nose seminars and things, you'll find that I already have sort of gateway indicators where to tell you what it is in the case that makes you want to open the case with a nosode of that kind. In the same way as that a lot of people who are working for long periods of time automatically start to get gateway indications. There is a signal in the case that tells them whether they're going to analyse according to a structured Shelton model. There's a signal or something in the narrative that tells them that purposiveness or a life theme that's based on meaningful or rationalized constructs leads you into a mineralized tabulation in the periodic table, or whether the narrative and the speech patterns and the cadences and the music of the actual delivery is something which is going to drive you to analyze the case in a more organic way. And as time goes on, every practitioner is getting a handle on gateway pathways, openings to a set of analysis methods that says, well, this is going to be a straight totality, or this one's going to be a Kentian case, or this one's going to be a Shelton triangulation, or this one's going to be a sensations method. What needs to happen over time is that those need to be somehow grounded in a way that helps new homeopaths make decisions quickly and in an informed way. We can, over time, if we collate cases well enough, see the pathways or the algorithms or the decision structures or the modeling in that case, compare it with other similar cases modeled similarly, and use that as a basis to inform or to help new homeopaths find their way in complexity. And I think that what you're saying is very important. The only way we can do that is by empirically gathering things in a way that will allow us to collate it later. We cannot see it in the everyday, we cannot see it week to week, or maybe even month to month, but we might be able to see it year to year or decade to decade. We might be able to establish those empirical patterns.